This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me. Donald Trump was swept into office by an elaborate series of lies on pop culture podcasts, but more than a year into his second term, the less engaged independent voters who powered his victory have turned firmly against the president. But as low as Trump's ratings are right now, the Democratic Party's favorability rating among Americans is even lower. How is this possible, and what does it mean? Depending on who you ask, you'll get a very different answer. Usually, however, the criticism that you'll find boils down to Democrats aren't offering my own personal policy viewpoints. The hard truth that a lot of people don't want to accept, however, is that many voters, if not the majority, have policy viewpoints that are not fixed, which means that focusing your campaign strategies based solely on opinion polls about issues is not going to work in the long term. Democracy in America is severely endangered because one of our country's two major parties has become a fascistic personality cult. But a strategy of protecting democracy that depends upon winning every single election forever is doomed to fail. And joining me today for a discussion about how to do that and where that begins is David Atkins. He's a longtime friend of the show and a member of the Democratic National Committee, and also a contributor to the Washington Monthly magazine. I hope you'll enjoy. Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network, so go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about politics, media, technology, and science, and how they all intersect to create our culture. And if you like what we're doing, you can give us a subscription. That would be great. We have free ones as well, though, if you can't afford that. You can get a subscription of either kind on patreon.com/discoverflux. And you can also subscribe on Substack at flux.community. Thanks a lot. Let's get into the program. And joining me now is David Atkins. Hey, Dave. Good to see you back on the show.
Hey, happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So you are a member of the Democratic National Committee, but you are here in your personal capacity. So we want to make sure to point that out.
Yes, I'm not an official spokesman for the DNC in this interview.
Yes. All right. So with that out of the way, one of the topics that I wanted to talk about here today is that Donald Trump, as I think everybody by now, or at least people who watch or listen to this podcast knows and read you, is that Donald Trump, he won not because of the fanatical, fascistic, right wing. He won because he kind of misled a lot of people who didn't know very much about politics. And those marginal Trump voters appear to have pretty much turned against him at this point. And his approval ratings are the lowest they've ever been. And in some polls, actually even lower than they were after January 6th, 2021. But the paradoxical thing is that the Democratic Party is rated as less popular in polls. And I think that's, it's causing some people to kind of project a lot of their own personal biases onto that data set, but there's a lot going on there. But ultimately, I mean, voters are still choosing the Democrats in elections.
Right. I think, right, there's a lot going on there. When you look at a statistic like such and such number of people dislike or like the Republican Party, or such and such dislike or like the Democratic Party, that is genuine. That is generally a confluence of many different factors. There's an old sort of saying in religious studies that every religion is sort of like a flashlight on the elephant, that everybody's sort of got a spotlight that nobody can see the whole elephant. I think you have a similar thing going on here. So you have the moderates who are saying, oh, this means that the Democratic Party is too far to the left and we need to come back to the center. And you've got leftists who are saying, well, the Democratic Party is bad on this issue or that issue. And if they were only farther left, I think it really depends on the person. I think it's all of those things are true for different segments of the electorate, which makes solving the problem challenging. But I think one thing you can say is there are a few major reasons for this happening. Number one, you have a low trust society in general. So all institutions are suffering across the board. Approval of every major institution is down. That having been said, not making excuses for the state of the Democratic Party approval, because I've been talking to various leaders in the party about this a lot with some alarm. I think, yes, right? There are some people who have joined the Trump coalition who used to vote for Democrats who feel that the party has shifted too far left on social issues. But rather than take the Iglesias sort of angle on this, that has been happening since the 1960s. You have been having realignment shifts like this for the past 50 or 60 years. And that doesn't mean that you need to stop expanding rights or stop advancing social change. And in any case, it's not Democratic candidates or the Democratic Party officially that is advancing civil rights in this way that is making those voters uncomfortable. So there's only so much the party per se can do about that. So when Matt Iglesias and those folks say, oh, the party needs to shift to the right, I mean, they're not talking about party candidates. They're talking about random activists on social media. So good luck, I guess. There is also another segment of people who are absolutely furious over Gaza or some other issue. And again, though, you can't really fault candidates so much for this. And candidates who have taken much more left positions on those issues are not actually faring better in elections by and large, with some exceptions. And we can talk about the Mamdani coalition and all of that. And I'm very supportive of AOC and Mamdani and those folks. But it's not exactly an electoral panacea. It's not like if every candidate adopted those positions, the party's fortunes would be reversed. It's not that simple either. I think the biggest thing that is impacting, though, approval of the Democratic Party, ironically, is from core normie Democrats. You ask a core normie Democrat who shows up to a No Kings protest and is furious with Trump if they approve of the Democratic Party, by and large, they're going to say no. Not because they like Trump, not because they think the party is too far left or too far right, but because the party is not doing a good enough job of standing up to the Republicans. And look, what some strategists and Chuck Schumer might say is, oh, we're doing exactly what we need to do to win elections. Look how well we're doing winning elections. Well, okay, maybe, but there's more to politics, ironically, than winning the next election. Right? You've got to keep people engaged and believing in you as an institution, believing in your values. Otherwise, you're just going to get a thermostatic effect where, okay, you win the next election, but the next time people get upset over inflation or whatever, you lose again. And if your entire premise of how you defeat fascism is we have to win every single election rather than we have to end fascism at its root, then you're going to lose. So there has to be more than just, oh, we're doing whatever it takes to win the next election by looking calm and looking like the good guys. So it's a lot of things, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And we'll come back to the thermostatic issue later. But yeah, it is shaping up when we look at the candidates who did win in the past 2025 election, the major candidates who won. What we're seeing is that that the real axis of approval for Democrats or energy is how much you want to oppose Trump, and it's not even as much of an ideological barrier. So, like we see, for instance, with Virginia, Abigail Spanberger has recently come out with some pretty tough restrictions on the Trump ICE thugs and what they're allowed to do legally within the state, and the degree to which Virginia law enforcement officers are allowed to cooperate with them or provide them information. And, so this is somebody who, in the conventional, left-right intra-democratic party splits, this is not somebody who, is on the further left of the party. But on the other hand, she also shares that desire to, vigorously oppose the authoritarianism of Donald Trump that Zoran Mamdani does.
Right. No, exactly. And this is one of the things, like I was not a big Spanberger supporter because she was on sort of the moderate side of a lot of policy fights that I was not approving of. But look at what, I mean, now I'm a big Spanberger fan because, hey, like those, she's not annoying me on any policy fights in Virginia, but what she is doing is standing up really strongly to Trump and ICE. And I couldn't be happier about that. And I know a lot of other folks who were Spanberger skeptics who are very happy with her as well. And I think that if we have more of that, in a real way. I think, that will also be helpful. You do see a lot of politicians sometimes in a cringy way coming out and using, F-bombs and this kind of language and, using stronger language now, which is nice to see as long as it actually feels natural. But, actually stepping forward and, demanding, say, to visit ICE detention centers, or actually, stepping forward and throwing real sand into the gears of the Trump regime. That's what people are looking for.
Yeah, and to kind of boil it down a bit here, what we're seeing is that there's kind of I would say that there are your policy views, there is your operation style, and then there's your communication style, and those are the three things that people are really caring about. And and what it's looking like is that there is kind of a real alignment that's shaping up in terms of communication style and operation style, that people are realizing the bigger problem here is that we have to stop fascism first, and then build the case simultaneously for a society that does address the issues that people are concerned about, and
Right.
but also is willing to talk about democracy, because I guess that has been kind of a debate point as well within the party, that a lot of people have said, well, the public doesn't care about protecting democracy, and other people say, well, no, they do. And it's I don't think you can say one way or the other. It's a matter of how you do it, is what I would say.
No, I agree. And I think that G. Elliott Morris, for instance, has had some very compelling data recently that people do care a great deal about protecting democracy. It also really matters, and this is sort of a a cart horse, like chicken egg kind of problem, in the sense that if you take the popularist view, which is based in large part upon a bunch of quantitative survey data, and we could go into all of the challenges with quant survey data. I'm a qualitative research guy by trade, and man, like, the mistakes that you can make just by paying attention to what a quantitative survey says are enormous. But of course, if you ask people in a quantitative survey what they care more about, the price of groceries or threats to democracy, most people are of course going to say the price of groceries. But there's a huge emotional investment in democracy as an idea. And if your leaders are not talking full-throatedly about the problems and the threats to democracy in a way that sounds like more than just the heated political rhetoric of the day, but if you manage to show people, no, like, you're actually not going to be able to vote for your leaders, there's actually going to be an accountability problem in your democracy, and these people are trying to set themselves up to rule for life. People do care about that. People do want to step up to defend that. And what's been shown in the data is not only are people actually concerned about this and increasingly concerned about this more than they were 6 months ago, in part because of the actions of the Trump administration, but also because when you have leaders not named, Chuck Schumer, but actual thought leaders who are now actually more credible on the left and within the Democratic Party, who are actively talking about this, people pay attention. Journalists pay attention. It becomes more part of the conversation. And lo and behold, voila, people start to care about it, even in the quantitative survey data. So you don't just have to reflect whatever the public opinion is from 6 months ago in a survey. You also have a role in talking about the issues of the day and shifting public opinion. Because you're not, and not even in a way that changes people's minds, but that changes the salience of the issue, that changes their focus and their understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into that, but I want to circle back to the problem with quantitative, claiming that your ideas are just pure math, which is what a lot of people that, especially of the self-identified popularists, they often say that they're just doing math, but they're really not. And but even aside from the fact that they are trying to promote their own ideological preferences, which they never state that. But setting their preferences aside, though, just this, and I can say this as somebody who used to do polls and write about them. So obviously, I think polls are very useful and important, but they're far less scientific than people imagine them to be, in part because just the very act of taking a survey is altering your mindset. And so it's taking you out of your regular mindset, which would be your ballot voting mindset. But it's also, it requires the pollster and the person to have the same understanding of the question. And there's no proof that that is true.
No.
It's like it relies on a fundamentally qualitative assumption without ever saying.
Right. Yeah, look, I mean, people have complicated thoughts about politics generally, especially undecided voters or cross-pressured voters, people whose vote is not already taken for granted. Typically, your partisans. I mean, they also have your partisans. Your deep partisans also have complicated thoughts about politics, but they're also somewhat more predictable. But especially people whose votes are winnable on either side tend to be either more ignorant of the issues or they tend to be really cross-pressured and conflicted, or both, right? To where if you ask them to explain themselves, if you ask them to explain what they think about an issue, you'll get some confused and maybe some contradictory, but also some complicated views on subjects like education, or maybe, trans rights, or maybe, taxation, or housing, or what have you. When you boil that down into a response to a poll question, right? And you're a sophisticated pollster, you understand this. First of all, even just baseline, the way you ask a poll question can have enormous biasing effects into the answers that you get. But even at that, this sort of goes back to George Lakoff and two frames of the world and all that. People operate with a lot of different frames in their mind about how the world works. And depending on which frame of how the world works you're activating, sometimes contradictory, sometimes parallel, people can come to different conclusions about what is important or how they want to perceive the issue that you cannot possibly reflect in a bubble answer on a quantitative poll. And you can get those to say almost anything that you want within reason. Whereas if you ask someone, hey, what do you think about housing? What should we do about housing in your ideal world? In a focus group, that you'll get a lot more honest answers. Of course, then you are, subject to the interpretations of a focus group when a consultant decides to write a report. But by and large, you're going to get much better idea of how the world works and how the electorate functions by just listening to a cross-section of maybe 60 undecided voters than you will getting the captured survey responses from 1,000. It may be statistically significant per the mathematics of stats, but the data you're getting is garbage. It's garbage in, garbage out for the most part. It's not total garbage, but it's not nearly as useful as a guideline as people want to believe it is.
Even if they did understand the question, you might be catching them in a moment where one particular opinion of theirs about this issue is more salient in their mind. And then if you were to talk to them the next day, another aspect might be more salient depending on whatever their circumstances are. And so, and to be fair, pollsters do always say that, this is just a snapshot in time. And I would say that the actual pollsters themselves are far more nuanced about what can be learned from polling than the popularists who kind of have like I call it cargo cult social science. Like that's what they're kind of doing. They're not, most of them do not do polls themselves, with some exception. And so they don't, they don't have direct experience at how fungible everything is, even though they know in principle about question wording distortions and whatnot. Until you've actually seen it with your own experience, I just, I don't see it as critical.
Right. And I think that the last thing that's really important and that's become very obvious from this last year of the Trump administration is and there's a very big difference between talking about theoretical policies on paper and the actual implementations of those policies when it comes to their real and emotional impacts, right? So say immigration. It's one thing to ask people when the general media environment on social media, Fox News and everywhere else has been ramping up this mass hysteria about immigration, to say, oh, do you want to deport all people who are not here legally? And you'll get a high number. Do you want to close the border entirely and deport everyone who lives here? And, in advance of the 2024 election, you were seeing fairly high numbers for that, which led people to say, oh, the Democrats need to move left on immigration. But the problem is the actual implementation of that policy is horrific, economically destructive, socially devastating. Nobody and what people have seen in the attempt to implement even a part of that policy, they hate what they're seeing. You could do the same thing for trans rights, right? Like where ultimately you have to go down to genital inspections of teenagers. Like the actual implementation of policies that might sound good to people on paper end up being horrific in practice. And it's one thing to ask about that in theory. It's another thing when it comes to the real world of politics and whether you want to allow those dry policies on paper and the questionnaire responses about that to drive the way you talk about it in a debate or on a policy stump speech or in an advertisement where you explain what these policies actually mean. You can't be scared by a 54% approval number for a horrific policy. You can't be scared about talking about what that actually means in terms of implementation. The Democrats did a terrible job of talking about what these policies would actually mean, which meant that Stephen Miller and his people thought they had a green light to do horrific things the public doesn't actually like.
Yeah. Well, and that does, go to the thermostatic nature of public opinion. So within political science, just for people who are not familiar with the term, the theory of thermostatic public opinion is that a lot of voters, perhaps even most, are motivated more about opposing things that they don't like than having an affirmative vision. And so there is this kind of large core of voters who are persuadable by either party, because whenever whenever a party gets into power, they do things that can be, these are the actual instantiations of the ideas, and sometimes people are like, oh gosh, well, I didn't want that. And so, and we're seeing a lot of that, as you noted with regard to Donald Trump, that a lot of people are saying, well, I didn't vote for him to do this. I didn't vote for him to, cut cancer funding. I didn't vote to ban, federal funding for vaccines. I didn't vote, so they're saying I didn't vote for that. But in reality, they did. They just were not educated enough about the positions of Trump on these issues. And that the thermostatic nature of public opinion, I think, has been a problem for Democrats because Republicans are so deceptive and willing to lie about their policies. And they've always been, ever since Barry Goldwater got wiped out in 1964, they've kind of realized, oh, well, we can't be upfront about what we actually want. And so we're just going to, speak in generalities and vague terms about, so people being responsible and law and order, and stop talking about their actual full positions.